The explosions in the early morning were so strong that windows trembled a full 80 kilometers away. By daybreak on June the 6th, the impact was clear. Blast had punched a large hole in the Nova Kakhovka dam in southern Ukraine, and there had also been severe damage to the hydroelectric station that it powers. The bridge alongside the dam was gone, and the fierce waters of the Dnieper were racing downstream. The consequences may turn out to be catastrophic. Several towns and villages in both Russian-occupied and Ukrainian-controlled parts of the Kherson area are now at acute risk of flooding. Many Ukrainians have learned to live with occupation and shelling. On Tuesday, a new menace began lapping at the doors. Significant damage to the dam and hydroelectric power plant on Ukraine's front line early Tuesday poses strategic challenges for both sides ahead of Ukraine's much-anticipated counter-offensive. However, who suffered greater losses? What were the strategic calculations of the parties involved in the Great Deluge battle? How did the flooded areas create a buffer zone? Would this catastrophe lead to a crisis at the nuclear power plant and the Crimea Peninsula? Let's find out in today's World Affairs. A major dam and power station in a Russian-occupied part of Ukraine were destroyed Tuesday, narrowing Ukraine's options for a planned counteroffensive in the south by unleashing a torrent of water that caused serious flooding. Russian forces seized the dam in February 2022. They pushed the Ukrainian workers out of the plant, created a military base at the site, and cut it off from Ukraine's electrical grid in October. This allowed water to flow to the Crimean Peninsula. After Russia occupied Crimea in 2014, Ukraine cut off the water supply flowing from the dam's reservoir. Ukraine said Russia was responsible for the destruction, which forced the evacuation of thousands from dozens of towns and villages on the Dnieper River, and could create an aquatic buffer zone for Russian forces on the southeastern bank. Russia accused Kiev of sabotaging the dam. Western intelligence agencies, including the U.S., are working to determine who is responsible for the dam burst, but are leaning towards Russia, a Western official said. All things considered, one must naturally assume that this was an aggression perpetrated by the Russian side in order to stop Ukraine's offensive aimed at liberating its own land. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said in a televised interview, adding that he long feared the dam would be attacked. The destruction of the dam could win Russia time to reconfigure its defenses, while at the same time depriving Ukraine of some options for its expected counteroffensive. Crossing the vast Dnieper River along that stretch of the front will now become impossible, said Nico Lensch, a former German Defense Ministry official. Russia could now redeploy resources from the southwest to reinforce other sections of the front, said Lensch. Kiev has kept a tight lid on where its counteroffensive would focus, but military experts have long said one of its main goals could be to sever the land bridge built between Russia and the Crimea Peninsula that Moscow annexed in 2014. The flooded region would have been one pathway to do so. Still, military analysts have seen a Ukrainian assault across the river as an unlikely option given the difficulty and likely cost of such an operation, as well as Ukraine's lack of amphibious capabilities. In the near term, it's hurting the Ukrainians more, said Mark Kenson, a retired Marine officer and defense expert with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Washington think tank. The barrier between Russians and Ukrainians has expanded at a time when it looks like the Ukrainian offensive is close to beginning, Kenson said. Now, with flooding rendering the area virtually out of play, Russians can move troops away from the river to more threatened areas. This is a hysterical reaction, spokesperson Natalia Humeniuk told an online briefing. They were aware that the movement of the Ukrainian defense forces would take place and in this way tried to influence the defense forces so that the crossing of the Dnieper, which they feared, would not happen. Secretary for Ukrainian President Mikhailo Podolyak also stated that Russian forces destroyed the dam to impede the counteroffensive of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Dnieper River divides the controlled territories of Russia and Ukraine in the Kherson province. The Ukrainian military controls the western bank of the river, while the eastern bank is occupied by Russian forces. This river is wide, and the Ukrainian military has very few advantageous positions to cross the river and launch a counterattack. When the Kakhovka Dam broke and the Dnieper River expanded significantly, the river crossing campaign became much more challenging, according to Dan Sabaj, a defense and security expert for The Guardian. Russian defensive positions on the eastern bank are built on high ground, preventing them from being flooded and giving them a better ability to hinder Ukrainian forces from crossing the river. The flood tide inundating the region will prevent the use of heavy weaponry, such as tanks, for at least a month, said Maciej Matisiak, security expert at the Stratpoints Foundation. This creates a very good defending position for Russians who expect Ukrainian offensive activity, Matisiak said. Analyst Michael Kaufman told the War Zone that the Russian military will bear the greater brunt of any problems associated with the breach. I don't think this significantly affects the Ukraine's military prospects or substantially improves Russia's position, he said. It makes a cross-river operation, which was a risky and difficult position to begin with, far less likely, while at the same time damaging the initial line of defenses Russian forces built up after November. Flooding will affect both Russian defensive belt and potential Ukrainian armed forces river crossing, supply lines, and upcoming offensive in Kherson, Mark Hertling, former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe and 7th Army, noted Tuesday in a Twitter thread. He was commenting on a situation where each side blames the other for blowing up the dam. Kiev and Moscow have blamed each other for the collapse of the Nova Kakhovka dam in southern Ukraine that sent floods gushing towards surrounding towns and farmland and forced hundreds of civilians to flee on Tuesday, on June 6th. For Russians, the reason to do it would have been to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive, obviously, and to create a humanitarian situation in Kherson, where people need to be evacuated, and to create swarms so that Ukrainians would not be able to use their mechanized infantry, for instance. So that would be the idea if the Russians have done it. If the Ukrainian side have done it, it would fit into the strategy of trying to distract the Russians. It kind of marks a turning point in a sense now that Ukraine has begun its counteroffensive, and this will be remembered most likely as intentional by whatever side the destruction of critical civilian infrastructure, because so far there have been many incidents, but this is the major one. In one upside for Ukraine, the flooding could also wash away fortifications and minefields put up by Russian forces in the area. However, that could be a potential danger rather than a blessing. The flooding could also expose underground landmines and wash them downstream. The Hallow Trust, a British-American charity that has been clearing mines planted by Russian troops, said that it was now operating in the flooded areas. Ihor Klimenko, Ukraine's Minister of Internal Affairs, said, "We urge citizens to be careful because water picks up explosive substances that can detonate. In addition, due to destruction of the engine room of the HPP, 150 tons of fuel oil got into the Dnieper. Groups with the necessary equipment have already set out to eliminate the possible consequences of an environmental disaster," he said. Maxa collected new satellite imagery of the Nova Kakhovka Dam on June 5, 2023, that reveals evidence that a section of the roadway and sluice gates have been recently damaged and destroyed. At the White House, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said the U.S. hadn't reached a final determination on who destroyed the dam. "We're still trying to assess what happened here. But the Russians had illegally taken over that dam and the reservoir many months ago, and they were occupying it at the time of its destruction," Kirby said. "It is very clear that the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure is not allowed by the laws of war," he said. "We know there are casualties," he said, "including likely many deaths, though these are early reports and we cannot quantify them." A senior NATO official said it was too early to say who was responsible. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he had convened his National Security and Defense Council to discuss the incident. "We're doing everything to save people," Zelensky said in a post to his Telegram channel. He previously said the dam's destruction, which he blamed on Russia, only confirms for the whole world that they must be expelled from every corner of Ukrainian land. Russia blamed the dam's collapse on Ukrainian shelling overnight into Tuesday. "We can definitely declare a deliberate sabotage on the part of the Ukrainian side," said Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. The sabotage was aimed to deprive Crimea of water and distract attention from the failure of the Ukrainian offensive, Peskov said. Russian President Vladimir Putin for the first time commented on the Kakhovka Dam breach in the Kherson province during a phone conversation with his Turkish counterpart Tayyip Erdogan on June 7. Putin stated, "The malicious actions have led to a large-scale humanitarian and environmental catastrophe." Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu previously accused Ukraine of destroying the water dam, alleging that Kiev wanted to relocate troops and equipment defending Kherson to other defensive positions to serve their counteroffensive plans. Following Minister Shoigu's statement, a Russian official claimed that Ukraine has already redeployed forces from Kherson to the Zaporizhia area. Up to 10,000 Ukrainian troops may be redeployed from Kherson to other areas. Following the strike on the Kakhovka hydropower plant, Ukraine can rapidly redeploy up to 10,000 troops from the Kherson area to other sections of the combat engagement line. Vladimir Rogov, leader of the We Are Together with Russia movement, told TASS on Tuesday, "We may be talking about several thousand Ukrainian militants, up to 10,000. They can be redeployed quite rapidly and covertly under the guise of rotation. The enemy sometimes manages to lure our villagers to sleep with a host of statements, moving combat vehicles back and forth, including without troops. These things require keen attention and additional forces to control them," he said. According to Rogov, Ukraine has already redeployed forces from Kherson to the Zaporizhia area. A significant part of the Ukrainian grouping in the Zaporizhia area consists of militants who have gained good experience in Kharkov and Kherson areas. They are convinced that they can win. They are well motivated and were trained in the West, from firing and combat coordination drills to the use of state-of-the-art weapons. Rogov told TASS earlier on Tuesday that the risk of attacks by Ukraine in Zaporizhia remains, since there are considerable reserves in the area that were not involved in the failed offensive. He anticipates that Ukraine's army will focus on the Zaporizhia direction, since Kiev is seeking to seize the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant and reach the Sea of Azov to block the land corridor to Crimea. Russia's purported attack on the Kakhovka Dam near a hydroelectric power plant indicates that Moscow is preparing to lose control of Crimea, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky described the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam as a war crime and an example of ecocide in a televised address to his nation Tuesday night. He promised that Russia will pay for its crimes, while suggesting that Putin's forces would soon flee Crimea. The fact that Russia deliberately destroyed the Kakhovka reservoir, which is critically important in particular for providing water to Crimea, indicates that the Russian occupiers have already realized that they will have to flee Crimea as well, Zelensky said. Ukraine will get back everything that belongs to it, he continued, and it will make Russia pay for what it has done. Zelensky also predicted that Ukrainian forces would restore normal life in Crimea after driving out Russian occupiers and regaining control of the peninsula. Mikhail Zarovzayev, Russia's appointed governor of Sevastopol, the largest city in Crimea and a major Black Sea port, said that the damage to the reservoir will not affect the city's water supply in any way. The city uses its own reservoir. Water reserves are at a maximum, and there are also backup sources of water supply, he wrote. Kherson said that the water shortages might hurt agricultural production in Crimea, but that drinking water isn't expected to be affected. Military analysts then said that neither side had anything to gain from destroying the dam, since it would affect both armies. Some military analysts cautioned against assigning blame with limited information. It is too early to tell whether this is a deliberate act by Russia or the result of negligence and prior damage inflicted to the dam, said Michael Kaufman, the director of Russian studies at CNA, a research institute in Arlington. This is a disaster that ultimately benefits nobody, Mr. Kaufman added. Footage posted online in the early hours of Tuesday showed vast quantities of water moving downstream from the power station, which separates Ukrainian and Russian-held parts of the Kherson region, and flowing through spaces where buildings comprising the power station have collapsed or been blown up. The dam contains about 18 million cubic meters of water, according to Ukrainian officials, and flooding endangers more than 80 settlements, including the major regional capital of Kherson. Tetiana Morozova, the regional director of Ukraine's postal service, who is currently in Kherson, said the city center has so far been spared from flooding because it lies on higher ground, but areas closer to the Dnieper River and many surrounding villages were submerged. Trains were evacuating people, mainly the elderly and infant, from the city, and volunteers were handing out humanitarian aid, she said. Some residents were walking knee-deep through the streets carrying dogs or cats they don't want to leave behind. There was panic in the morning, but now it has passed. People can see they are being cared for, she said. Residents in the town of Antonivka, about 40 miles downstream, described watching in horror as floodwaters swept by carrying trees and debris from washed-out houses. The Ukrainian authorities raced to evacuate people by train and bus. For miles along the floodplain, others waded through water, rescuing pets and belongings. Videos and images on social media showed. Some people rode bicycles down streets submerged in muddy water. In Mykolaiv, an emergency train collected those fleeing the rising waters in Kherson. Daria Shuzik, 38, an office manager, awoke to what sounded like pouring rain, but it was rushing water filled with the detritus of the town. There were a lot of dirt, branches, parts of buildings, fences, cattails from swamps, everything, she said. Ms. Shuzik said the Russian military had created a disaster. I don't know why they started this war and why they carry on, she said. Agriculture will suffer and the Black Sea will suffer because all this is flowing into the sea. Even the fish will suffer now. Even as the water levels rose, Russian troops were still shelling the town on the outskirts of the city of Kherson. Tatiana Yeroshenko, 32, a teacher and volunteer with an aid group, said by phone that she woke up around 5 a.m. Tuesday to artillery explosions. I heard a boom and my windows shook, Ms. Yeroshenko said. Then she checked her phone and saw a news report of the major flood. UNAID Chief Martin Griffiths told the UN Security Council that the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe will only become fully realized in the coming days. Beavers were spotted earlier today following the explosion of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant's dam in southern Kherson, as escalation between the Russian and Ukrainian forces is once again exhibited. There are a lot of beavers in that area. Their habitat has been destroyed, tweeted Anton Gerashchenko, an advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Internal Affairs. Animals are also victims of the ecological catastrophe Russia caused by blowing up Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. The destruction could affect the water supply to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which relies on the reservoir to cool its reactors, experts say. A spokesman for Ukraine's state nuclear energy company said water levels in the Kakhovka reservoir that supplies water to the facility were rapidly decreasing, but levels inside the plant's cooling pond were currently sufficient. All of the plant's 6 reactors have been in cold shutdown mode for months, and the flooding is happening downstream from the facility. Reactors in shutdown mode still need small amounts of water for cooling, but the plant has sufficient reserves as part of its contingency plans, said Mark Newson, managing director of Radiant Energy Group, an energy consulting firm. In case the water supply ceased entirely, the plant management could bring in cooling waters by trucks or other means, he added. The Moscow-appointed mayor of Nova Kakhovka, the Russian-occupied town that adjoins the dam, said shelling at around 2 a.m. on Tuesday had caused it to collapse. He didn't specify from which side the shelling had come. As a result, water from the Kakhovka reservoir has begun to flow uncontrollably downstream, the Russian-appointed official Vladimir Leontev was quoted as saying. The flooding will also hit Ukraine's large agricultural industry, which is one of Kiev's main sources of revenue, and a key supplier of grains for the developing world. Video footage on social media showed submerged grain storage, while local farmers said that water above the dam was used to irrigate their crops. Farmers in occupied Crimea will also be hit because this water is key to their own harvests. The dam, the southernmost one of the Dnieper, was built between 1950 and 1956 as part of a broader effort to capitalize on the economic power of the river, known as the Great Dnieper. The dam has been destroyed before in its long history. The Soviets demolished it in 1941 to halt the advance of Nazi Germany's troops in World War II. The Nazis then repaired it, only to blow it up again when they were retreating in 1943. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba described the dam's destruction as ecocide, adding, Russia destroyed the Kakhovka Dam, inflicting probably Europe's largest technological disaster in decades, and putting thousands of civilians at risk. Ihor Sirota, the head of Ukraine's main hydropower generating company, said in an interview that it had collapsed after an explosion about 2:50 a.m. Tuesday. The damage is huge and the station can't be repaired, he said. The lower part of it has already been washed away. The dam's destruction was a monumental humanitarian, economic, and ecological catastrophe, and yet another example of the horrific price of war on people, said Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General. It has come to an end of our program today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.